There are moments in history that do not announce themselves with sirens or speeches. They arrive quietly. They arrive in the form of a man standing at a podium in Montreal on a Tuesday afternoon, surrounded by the workers of a defense company called CAE, and saying 11 words that changed the relationship between two nations forever. This has created vulnerabilities that we can no longer afford. That was Mark Carney, Prime Minister of Canada, speaking not to his own people first, speaking, in that moment, directly to Washington, directly to the White House, directly to a president who had spent the better part of a year calling Canada's leaders weak, calling their economy small, calling their country a burden that America had carried for too long out of the goodness of its heart. And what Carney said in those 11 words, what he communicated with the quiet, deliberate precision of a man who has spent his entire career in rooms where words move billions of dollars, was this: "We are done. We are done depending on you. We are done paying you 75 cents of every defense dollar we spend. We are done building our security on a foundation that you have decided unilaterally to pull out from under us. We are done, and we have a plan. The plan is called Canada's first ever defense industrial strategy. And when you hear the numbers, really hear them, not as abstract figures on a government press release, but as a statement of national intent delivered by a country that has been pushed too far, you will understand why defense analysts in Washington, economists in New York, and military officials in Brussels are calling this the most consequential single announcement in the history of the U.S.-Canada relationship. Over $500 billion, $500 billion, $366 billion in American currency, directed not at American companies, not at American military contractors, not at the American defense industrial base that has consumed 3/4 of every Canadian defense dollar for generations, directed at Canada, directed at Canadian workers, Canadian factories, Canadian sovereignty, and the explicit stated unambiguous goal of ensuring that Canada is never again, in Carney's own words, hostage to the decisions of others when it comes to its own security. Let that sentence sit for a moment. Hostage to the decisions of others. That is the language of a sovereign nation describing its relationship with its closest ally. That is the language of a country that has looked at what Donald Trump has done to the rules-based global order, looked at what he has done to the trade relationship between two nations that share the longest undefended border on Earth, looked at the tariffs and the insults and the suggestion that Canada should simply become the 51st state and accept American terms without complaint, and decided that enough is enough, that the dependency itself is the vulnerability, that the comfort of the relationship had become the cage. And here is what makes this story different from every other political announcement you have watched this week, this month, this year. This is not rhetoric. This is not a press conference talking point designed to look strong before an election. This is $500 billion. And in the world that Warren Buffett has spent 60 years navigating, $500 billion is not a statement. It is a verdict. It is a country saying, in the language that actually matters, the language of capital, of investment, of economic commitment across a decade, we have made our decision, and we are not reversing it. To understand what happened in Montreal on February 17, 2026, you have to understand what led to it, because this announcement did not happen in a vacuum. It happened at the end of a road that has been getting narrower and darker for 11 months since Mark Carney took office and found himself leading a country that was being systematically targeted by the most powerful nation on Earth. Trump began with the tariffs. 25% on Canadian goods, across the board, steel, aluminum, auto parts, agricultural products. The tariffs that analysts at the Peterson Institute estimated would cost the Canadian economy between $40 and $60 billion annually. The tariffs that Canadian manufacturers said would force plant closures, layoffs, and the restructuring of supply chains that had been integrated across the border for 30 years under NAFTA and its successor agreements. The tariffs that Trump announced not as a negotiating position, not as an opening bid in a good faith trade discussion, but as punishment, as a message, as a demonstration that America could impose costs on its neighbor whenever it chose to, for whatever reason it chose to, and that Canada had no meaningful ability to resist. And then came the rhetoric that went beyond trade. Trump calling Canada's leaders puppets. Trump suggesting that Canadian politicians were weak, were ineffective, were incapable of protecting their own people's interests. Trump at rallies, Trump on social media, Trump in the Oval Office with cameras rolling, suggesting that Canada as a sovereign nation was something of a fiction, that its economy was a dependent appendage of the American economic body, that without American goodwill and American markets and American military protection, Canada was nothing. Less than nothing, a burden that America had been charitable enough to carry. And then came the suggestion that went further than any American president had gone since before either of these countries had living memory of what came before. The suggestion that Canada should simply become part of the United States, the 51st state, not as a joke, not as a rhetorical flourish, as a stated desire, as something Trump returned to, repeatedly, in public, with the particular kind of insistence that suggests a man who has genuinely persuaded himself that what he is proposing is reasonable, is generous even, is something the other side should be grateful to be offered. What Trump did not understand, what the advisers around him apparently failed to communicate with sufficient force, is that suggesting a sovereign nation voluntarily dissolve itself into its neighbor does not read as generosity to the people of that nation. It reads as contempt. It reads as a declaration that you do not regard their nationhood as legitimate, their sovereignty as real, their identity as something worth preserving. And when a leader makes that declaration often enough, loudly enough, with enough apparent sincerity, something shifts in the country on the receiving end, something that cannot be shifted back. Carney understood this. He had been watching it happen. As Prime Minister, he had been navigating a relationship with Washington that was becoming less like a partnership between allies and more like a negotiation between a landlord who controls the heat and a tenant who is told to be grateful for the warmth. He had been absorbing the insults publicly with the controlled diplomacy of a man who knows that responding in kind accomplishes nothing and costs everything. He had been preparing quietly, methodically, with the particular patience of someone who was trained as a central banker, who spent years at the Bank of England and the Bank of Canada making decisions that would not produce visible results for years, who understands that the most powerful moves are often the ones that look slow until suddenly they do not look slow at all. On February 17, 2026, in Montreal, at the facilities of CAE Incorporated, a Canadian defense company that builds flight simulators and military training systems used by air forces around the world, Mark Carney stopped being patient. The numbers he announced that day were not modest. They were not a diplomatic gesture or a symbolic commitment designed to signal resolve without requiring sacrifice. The defense industrial strategy that Carney unveiled represents the largest single defense investment in Canadian history by an order of magnitude that makes every previous Canadian defense commitment look like a rounding error. 80 billion Canadian dollars in direct government defense spending over the next 5 years, not over a decade, over 5 years. That is $16 billion a year of direct government spending on building, equipping, and expanding the Canadian Armed Forces, which had been chronically underfunded for so long that a retired Canadian general named Andrew Leslie had described the Army as dramatically underfunded just days before the announcement, saying that 75% of Canadian defense capital spending had been flowing to American contractors, creating exactly the dependency that Carney was now declaring finished. 180 billion Canadian dollars in defense procurement opportunities. This is the money that goes to actually buying military hardware, aircraft, ships, vehicles, communication systems, surveillance equipment, weapons. And here is the detail that will make the defense contractors in Bethesda and Arlington and Huntsville, Alabama, pay very close attention. The strategy specifies that this procurement will prioritize Canadian companies. Build in Canada. Partner with Canada. Buy Canadian. That is the framework Carney announced. In that order. Canada first, then partners. American companies are not excluded, but they are no longer the default. They are no longer the automatic first call. They are no longer the assumption.